Hi, it's Heather, and now that we're getting our hands on some data, let's take a minute to talk about what we mean by data. There are many definitions and concepts and ideas of what data actually is, and there's really no one right or one wrong definition or way to think about data. But it's very important for you to understand what you mean by the word data and also what your colleagues, editors, analysts, journalists, what exactly they mean by data. It can avoid a lot of heartache and a lot of miscommunication if we just take a couple of minutes to think about what we mean by data. For the purposes of this module, we're going to be talking about data that's quantitative in nature. So there are many different kinds of data, focus group data, stories, photos, ethnography. There's a lot of different kinds of data. This module is going to be talking about quantitative data, so things that can be counted, things that are in spreadsheets. And within that concept of data, there's really three different types. There is microdata, which is raw data that is one subject or one unit of analysis on a line. So if it's the census data, that means that each person in the census is one row on your spreadsheet, and that you can look at the education level, the labor force status, the age, the date of birth, the country of origin, the language spoken of each individual just by looking at their row. So that's called microdata, where there's one row for each person or one row for each thing that's being measured, if it's not people, if it's string beans or fish. The next level of data is aggregate data. So that's when you take this microdata and you kind of roll it up into some summaries. So if you are looking at a county and you're looking at the number of men and number of women in that county, that's an aggregate of census data. So that's the microdata, the level 1 microdata rolled up into level 2 aggregate data. So if you're looking at, say, a summary table of average income by race and gender within a state, you're looking at aggregate data. That's level 2. And level 3 is statistical information. So statistical information is when you take that microdata or that aggregate data and you run it through some kind of a process or a statistical model or some exploratory analysis, and you get some summary statistics. So an overall weighted average or a probability of a county having soil quality levels that are so and so high. Those are called statistics or statistical information. So 3 levels: microdata, aggregate data, and statistical information. All very valuable, all have uses. It's just important to know which one you're looking for or working with in your journalism work. Now we have an understanding of basically what we mean by data for this course. There's 3 different things you can do with that data. The first is that you can take another person's research or another group of people, take their research and summarize it and make it accessible to your audience. That is quite commonly done in data journalism because there's a lot of scientific publications or complex policy analysis that people aren't going to sit down and read 45 pages of. So it's important in data journalism to take complex research and present it in a way that's useful and accessible to your audience. So the second thing that data journalists often do in using data is to take a number of different pieces of research and summarize them and draw connections between them. That's often a very interesting undertaking, and a good example of that is to find research on refugees and the number of refugees that are coming to and from different countries, and then looking at the changes in average income in those different places and maybe draw some connections between the economic motivations of refugees. That's an example of doing some data journalism reporting that takes other people's research and connects it as a possibility, and then writing a data-based piece. The third thing that you can do is do your own analysis. So find a piece of data, probably microdata, although it could sometimes work with aggregate data depending on how complicated the question is and the data. So find your own data and do your own analysis. This is definitely the most complicated of these three approaches, but it does offer you the opportunity to maybe answer questions that nobody's answered before. And in most of the rest of this course, we'll be focusing on that third approach, where we'll be doing exploratory data analysis with actual microdata. Let's look at an example. Let's look at an example with the refugee story that we were exploring before. And here's an article from The Guardian talking about how a large proportion of current refugees appear to be children. So that's a very interesting angle. We did see some glimpses of that hook in the data that we were looking at in the previous video. And this is an example of The Guardian doing that first approach, which is summarizing someone else's research. The Guardian does do its own research from time to time, but this is an example of The Guardian summarizing someone else's research. And it looks to me like this article is based on this press release. They came out at a very similar time and they're reporting very similar numbers. So I believe that the Guardian article was probably based on this press release or something very similar to it. And then if we back up the next step, this press release seems to be linked to this site, which provides you with aggregate data. So if you wanted to work with the aggregate data having to do with children and migration, this is where you would look. And if you wanted to take a step even back, deeper into the data, this aggregate site links to this site, which is where the microdata is. So this site right here is where you can get the very detailed data and do your own analysis. And you might want to consider doing your own analysis because it, according to this article, in a less reputable source than The Guardian, I must say, does point to the fact that saying that all these refugees are children may or may not be misleading. So that could be an interesting angle to explore, and you would probably want to explore that with the microdata. So there's where you download the microdata, and then the next thing you would do with the microdata is really get to understand the data before you do any analysis, and that's what we'll be talking about next.